Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are on Lesson 17, Chapter 17, which is all about designing for mobile devices. As you can imagine, this is a very important chapter because the majority of people that are going to view your site are on mobile devices. There's my cat in the background. Don't mind her. So what we're going to learn in this lesson, we're going to learn how mobile design differs from standard web design. We're going to learn what mobile design first philosophy really is. We're going to learn how mobile first is important to responsive web design. We're going to learn how to build responsive tables and images for mobile devices. And we're going to learn how to use CSS columns to create responsive designs without media queries. So when we talk about designing for mobile devices, it's more than just testing to see if your website works on a mobile phone. Really, the best mobile designs, they treat mobile devices as if they are just as important, if not more important, than desktop computers. This can be a little bit shift of focus because most developers and web designers are actually working from a computer, not a phone. So it causes a little bit change of focus because you're designing for something that's not the platform that you're working on. The reason why mobile design is so important is because more and more people are viewing content from their mobile devices. People access their phones all the time for anything and everything. So chances are, if you're a company, a business, or you just want to do a personal blog site, the majority of your users are going to be looking at your site from their mobile device. Another thing why it's important is that search engines will penalize you if your website is not mobile friendly. If someone is searching for your business or site and it's not mobile friendly, it may not be ranked high in the search results, meaning it may not easily be found. This chapter goes over this really cool tool that will actually test to see if your site is mobile friendly. So you can go on that. It's search.google.com/test/mobile-friendly, and that URL is in your book in chapter 17. You simply put the URL of your website, or you can upload directly the code to your website, and it will tell you if it's mobile friendly, or if it isn't, why it isn't. It's good to test any site that you're working on to see if it's mobile friendly before you publish it into a live environment. There are a few specific things that Google looks for when testing your site to see if it's mobile friendly. And they want to look to see if it's using Flash, if you're configuring the viewport, if you have fixed width designs, if you have images and other box sizes. You want to check your font sizes, and if you have tappable elements. When you're building a mobile-friendly site, you should also consider simplifying the layout and the navigation, keeping the download time short, and testing on real devices. So Flash, something that was mentioned, is not mobile-friendly. You want to avoid using fixed width designs. If you're going to use fixed width designs, you have to make two versions, one for small devices and one for larger devices. You want to make sure your elements fit in the design. So one problem you might see on sites is that when they're viewed on mobile site, the images are just way too big. To fix this, you want to use relative widths and position values such as percentages. You should also make sure your images scale with the device so they don't end up running off to the edge. Another thing when developing for mobile is you want to keep your font sizes legible. So since most mobile devices use touchscreens, that means your links need to be tappable. If your links are too small or too close together, they will not be easily tapped. The minimum size that can be tapped easily is around 48 pixels by 48 pixels. So the first thing you should do is ensure that all your links and buttons are that size. The best way to create these links is to adjust the display property for navigation links, and your book gives you an example on how to do that. So one of the best things you can be doing when designing for mobile devices is to simplify your layouts and simplify your navigation, but do so without sacrificing any of your content. Designing for mobile devices can be challenging. It's challenging because you're actually using a desktop or a laptop, a computer, to design for a mobile device. So usually when you're trying to simplify layouts, you want to start with the number of columns, and you can think of the ideal number of columns on most smartphones would be 1. That's why when you see a responsive site go to a smartphone, everything kind of stacks up on top of each other in that one column. It could be difficult to see on bigger screens, so make the mobile version of the site by 1 column and then add columns for larger screens. The mobile version of the site, it should include navigation to the same parts of the site as the desktop version, but it should be simplified. Submenus are pretty difficult to read on a mobile device, so avoiding more than one level of submenus is a good idea. Download speed is an important thing to keep in mind developing for mobile devices. The thing is, images take up your largest amount of bandwidth, so when you're developing for mobile devices, you want to make sure that your images are as small as possible while still remaining clear and of good quality. Your book goes over some best practices for using images in your website, such as always use a JPEG or a PNG format. You want to crop images to keep the dimensions as small as possible, and use the Save for Web option in image editing programs like Adobe Photoshop. It has a Save for Web or a web version. The next thing we want to talk about is testing our mobile web pages. Testing can be challenging because there's many different types of mobile devices and many different types of tablets. So when testing, you want to start with your desktop browser. Modern browsers often have a responsive design mode. Now, without actually having the device itself to test with, they do make some emulators. You can use an iPhone emulator or an Android emulator. Those emulators are available in Android Studio, Apple Xcode Simulator, Windows Mobile emulators. Your book has a list of those URLs of some emulators you can use. So when you hear mobile first, and we talk about mobile first design, designing for a mobile device first and then making it work for a desktop and computer. So why this works is because you focus on getting the required content and functionality to as many customers as possible, and then you enhance the site for more diverse devices. So there's a lot of different devices out there, such as smartwatches and smartphones, tablets, and computers. So majority of users are probably going to be looking with their cell phones, with their mobile devices. So you develop for a mobile device first, and then make your site be able to work for a desktop, a laptop. One of the biggest drawbacks to mobile first, though, is that it can be hard to implement. So you start out building your design on a really small screen, which is difficult to build a fully functioning website on a small, tiny screen, especially if you're designing for something like a smartwatch, for example. You have to make sure your pages look okay on that really small screen. Your book then goes on and talks about using responsive tables and images, which two aspects of websites that can be difficult to make responsive are tables and images. Data tables, they're usually pretty big, they have a lot of data, and they're usually harder to handle in a responsive web design atmosphere. And images can be frustrating too because they take up so much space on small screens, and then it could be barely visible on a larger screen. Also, images can take a really long time to load. So when you make a table responsive, you want to figure out what data is really essential to the table and must display across all devices. And then you want to think about how do customers compare the data on the table, and then what are the sizes at which the table no longer is readable or is no longer displays legibly on the screen. So talking about mobile first design, it really says that you should include the same data in some shape, way, or form across all devices, but you can hide the less crucial information until users need it. So when you're making a table, you'll need to consider where the table breaks, meaning at what point of a screen size will it kind of distort or not show. And there are three ways you can handle data tables with responsive web design. One would be to resize the cells, to rearrange the table, or to remove or hide content. Your book goes through and gives you some examples on resizing cells in a data table, as well as rearranging table rows and columns. And it also talks about how you can hide table content. It then goes through and gives you more detail on how to make images responsive. So instead of setting a fixed width, you actually use a flexible width for your images, such as a percentage. If you set the width and max width of your images to 100% and the height to auto, it resizes the image when the screen is a different size. And this is probably the simplest, easiest way to do it. There are two other solutions that are better because they allow the images to be more responsive, and that is explained in your book as well. Using media queries is the most common way to create different layouts on devices of different sizes, but a technique that a lot of people don't think about or just overlook is using CSS columns, which we talked about in lesson 6. We learned how to write CSS columns to create layouts, but we didn't realize at that point that we can actually use CSS columns to create responsive layouts. You can create columns by declaring the column count or the column width, but if you declare both, such as with the columns property, you create a column layout that will adjust depending upon the width of the browser. Your book goes through and gives you a whole example of a responsive layout with columns without media queries. It also goes through and talks about sometimes when you wouldn't want to use responsive web design. As in anything we do, there are pros and cons. One of the cons to responsive web design is that It primarily relies on technology that needs up-to-date modern devices and modern browsers. So if you make a responsive website and someone has a really old browser or a really old device, it may load a lot more slowly, or it may not even load at all. And there's a couple other drawbacks, and you just have to weigh out the options on what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks for what approach you're going to use. This chapter just lays them out for you. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you some examples of what we talked about in this lesson. Here's an example of a basic HTML table. We have our table, their table head, and the table body, the rows. Notice I commented out the CSS. With just the body of the table, it displays like this. If I were to resize this, it's not very responsive. It adjusts a little bit. It doesn't mean it's really easy to read. So by adding some styles, border collapse, set it to collapse, display the whole table as a block, hide the headers, save this and reload. This is what we can do to a table to make it look a lot nicer on a mobile device. And this is about redesigning and thinking about the device your user is going to be on and making the content look more presentable. Another example, same thing. We have a table with contact information. So name, title, homepage, email. When we resize this, they get a little bigger, but then it cuts off some of the stuff. Same thing, border collapse, collapse. Display the whole table as a block. Hide the headers. This behaves like a row. We're labeling our data. Save this and reload. And now it's a lot more legible. Responsive images. I went over this a little bit in last lesson. So when the CSS width property is set as a percentage value, the image will scale up and down when resizing the browser window. So we can resize this browser window and see the effect. And this image here, width 100%, max width 100%, height auto. And that's just a simple, easy way to make an image responsive. This is a responsive column layout with media queries. So here we have content would be here, and then content would be here. So when we resize, notice how it gets to the point where a little stack. So I'm going to show you how to get some content. So if you go on Google and type lorem ipsum, you can use a lorem ipsum generator, and we can do paragraphs, generate this, and we can get some of this text here. We could add it to our site. So I'm going to add this paragraph with some text. And I'm going to do the same thing here. So now we have some content here. I'm going to reload this. So now we can see. And that's what I encourage you to do when you're developing a site. If you need some just dummy text, filler text, use the lorem ipsum generator. So now when I resize this, it's going to hit a threshold where it will stack on top of each other. I hope those examples helped. Coming up next, we have our lesson 17 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.